message to say it's on. There we go. And that's, I think, all from me. Paul, I'll hand over to you to introduce Nick.
Thank you, Keith. Welcome, everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce Nick Birns for our second presentation in our virtual conference series. Nick is well known to most of you, I think. He's our North American focal point. He's a regular contributor to our conferences in the past and to the newsletter. And of course, Nick has written a must-read book, Understanding Anthony Powell, which I could recommend to everybody. It's one of the best introductions to AP's work. Nick will be talking to us today about AP and childhood. So Nick, over to you, and I'll go to share screen so I can show your slides as well.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate your introduction, Paul, and thank you very much for your kind words about my book. And it's a great pleasure to see over 82 people registered, 58 in so far. Thank you for coming out. I know we have Zoom fatigue after 2 years of all this, and it's wonderful so many people are tuning in. So Paul, are you sharing the screen or should I?
Yeah, everybody should be able to see it now.
Okay, you're saying yes, I'm seeing it too. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so my topic is Anthony Powell and childhood. Next slide, Paul.
Okay, let's see if I can do it.
If it's easier for me to do this, I can do it, but.
Right, okay, let me just, sometimes it, yeah, here we go.
Yeah, there we go. There you go.
Yeah.
Very good. Yeah, okay, that's the second one. Thank you. Okay. And people often talk about Anthony Powell as if he did not write about childhood and if the content of his work is only adult social interaction. And the gravamen of this talk is to argue against that and to say that his oeuvre over journals, memoirs, novels does actually give a quite interesting and substantive account of childhood, and that childhood as a theme is very important to his work. And I think the locus classicus of any such argument has to be from Infants of the Spring, his first volume of his memoirs, my very tattered copy, you can see it here, which I bought in 1980. And this passage where Anthony Powell, what's musical instruments, is Moreland in yet? We are going to talk about Moreland, but not yet. So let's defer any talk of musical instruments till then. This is from Infants of the Spring, and this is when Anthony Powell, circa 1910, realizes that he is indeed Anthony Powell. It is a coming to self. One afternoon, I was about 5 or 6. We had returned from Kensington Gardens and were waiting outside the doors of the flat to be let in. After the park and the street, the interior of the building seemed very silent. A long beam of sunlight, in which small particles of dust swam about, all at once slanted through an upper window on the staircase and struck the opaque glass panels of the door. On several occasions recently, I had been conscious of approaching the brink of some discovery, an awareness that nearly became manifest and suddenly withdrew. Now the truth came flooding in with the dust-infested sunlight. He writes, the revelation of self-identity was inescapable. There was no doubt about it. I was me. That devastatingly concise and clear. Subject, verb, object. I was me. That is self-consciousness. And people talk about that in St. Augustine or Montaigne or Thomas Traherne, the famous How Like an Angel I Came Down poem, which Anthony Powell, as a student of the 17th century, well knew. This is one of the masterpieces of a small child coming to consciousness and realizing that he is himself. And it's so interesting because why should one need that transitive? Isn't it just I? Why do you need the transitive of I was me? Usually subject, verb, object is Jack hit the ball. but here it's all within the self. I was me. And that in a way, the self that just experiences things is different from the particular self that contemplates things. So that it's an incredible moment. And I think a lot of us might remember moments as children when we realized we were ourselves. I myself had such a moment. And it really has not been written about more effectively than Paul. Again, I think the Morlandian portion of the program is not coming until later. So can we shut off the music? Let me see what's happening there. Just let me see. I think that's actually on my thing. But, sorry. Yeah. That, interestingly, that was on my thing. That was a flute concerto by Frederick II of Prussia, which I was earlier playing for my students. So perhaps like the Karl Marx on the Ouija board in the acceptance world, that was Frederick the Great obtruding himself. Sorry for the interruption. But the idea of this self-consciousness and capturing what it is as a child to feel that oneself is oneself. And that is a kind of introspection and a recollection of childhood feelings for which Anthony Powell as a novelist is seldom given credit. And I think for a lot of us AP fans, we are frustrated by the way that our author is often put in a box or damned with faint praise or given credit for doing some things well, but him not being talked about as if he was one of the truly great novelists who, when he wants to, can do almost anything. And this is an example of him being able to do something which very, very few people give him credit for. So it's a very important passage in his work. Next slide, please, Paul. And these are pictures from Infants of the Spring of Powell's boyhood. And you see the very young Paul in 1905-06. You see his first passport photograph at age 12, already looking very distinctively himself. And you see him on a horse. Of course, one thinks of Zooch on Creditor and From a View on a Death, but From a View to a Death, but hopefully no such accident occurred with the young AP. And Anthony Powell had a childhood. That's all these pictures are saying. And that childhood made an impression on him. He was an only child. And that is going to be very important to my argument, that as an only child, unlike his wife, unlike Lady Violet, who in her autobiography, I mean, the relevant volume of her autobiography is 5 out of 6. She is one of a lot of siblings. He is an only child and has an only child's world. And that is very different from being a child with siblings. But he has a childhood, and that childhood informs his career as a novelist, and it informs himself, even if, other than in the first section of The Kindly Ones, he never writes in his fiction directly about his childhood. That's the only instance. It's important to realize that this is somebody who, like any other writer, his childhood informed his work. That he doesn't write books like Dickens did or Mark Twain did, which are devoted to childhood, does not mean it isn't there. And of course, the title of the slide alludes to the painting Boyhood of Cyrus, the Edgar Deacon painting, which hung so memorably in the walls of the London residence of Sir Gavin Walpole Wilson. Next slide, please, Paul. And this is a quote from Byers Market about Boyhood of Cyrus. Just as the first sight of Boyhood of Cyrus, by its association with Mr. Deacon and life before the war, had brought back memories of childhood, the sight of Wimberpool called up in a similar manner almost like some parallel scene from Mr. Deacon's Brush entitled Boyhood of Wimberpool, all kinds of recollections of days at school. I remember the interest once aroused in me by Wimberpool's determination to become a success in life, and the brilliance with which Stringham used to mimic his movements and manner of speech. And this is a very key moment in dance, because this is the first moment of nostalgia in dance, and the first moment of recapitulation in dance. Whereas is to happen in the 10 subsequent volumes, we reflect on the characters we had known earlier and their continuing significance and continuing relevance. And we go back to Wimberpool and Stringham and Templar in a kind of spiral. And the narrative gets back in touch with those earlier strata. But this is very key. It's via Mr. Deacon, who is somebody Nick Jenkins has known in childhood, somebody who is a friend of his father. And Mr. Jenkins Sr., Colonel Jenkins, is represented much like we know Philip Lionel Powell, Anthony Powell's father, to have been a military officer, but somebody who had artistic and aesthetic interests and would have been friends with somebody very different, Edgar Deacon, a bohemian painter and somebody pretty obviously known to be gay, but he was nonetheless friends with him. And so this epiphany about Wimberpool and that Wimberpool at school is going to continue to inform the narrative is done via an even more atavistic level of childhood, because Nick Jenkins had known Mr. Deacon before school, before Wimberpool, before Stringham. Note also that he hasn't really known Wimberpool as a boy, not as a young boy. He only knew him at school when they were already about 15. But he's imagining the boyhood of Wimberpool, what it might like to be Wimberpool. And this is very important for a buyer's market, because both Wimberpool and Jenkins are in love with Barbara Goring. But for Wimberpool, Barbara Goring was the unattainable beauty next door, the unattainable beauty on the great in the great house to which his family was inferior. Whereas to Nick Jenkins, Barbara Goring was just somebody he met at debutante dances as a man in his 20s and fell in love with. And this prepares us for realizing, as we realize in the sugar pouring incident, that Barbara actually means something more to Kenneth than she does to Nick. Note Boyhood of Cyrus. And Powell was a good reader of Herodotus, and he knew that the myth of Cyrus the Great, fortunately a name one does not hear much in everyday life, which was good for Nicholas Jenkins, because every time he heard it, he thought of his unrequited love for Barbara Goring. But in Herodotus, Cyrus is the grandchild of the Median king, Astyages, and his grandfather tries to kill him. And his boyhood is a tale of suffering from which he comes back, which is also what Wimberpool feels, the way he was condescended to on the Gorings Nottinghamshire estate. I think it's Pembringham Woodbridge or something like that. That is, he feels in a way like a little wounded Cyrus who will wreak his vengeance to become the great emperor and so on. So that whole scenario is there. Next slide, please, Paul. The Albert Memorial, and this is very interesting. In Buyer's Market, the Albert Memorial is the symbol for his courtship of Barbara. And it's the token of their romance, that they're often passing by there or in that neighborhood. Buyer's Market says the nodular gilt pinnacles of the Albert Memorial, towards which we are steadily moving. And in Buyer's Market, the divorce of maturity from childhood coexist with memories of the long past and forgotten associations of childhood from Infants of the Spring. We know that, growing up in Kensington, spending his first few years in Kensington, he goes to the Albert Memorial and sees shining gilt serration of the Albert Memorial's spire. And so it's interesting that Jenkins, we know nothing of where Jenkins spent his childhood. Oh, we know of that as Stonehurst. We don't know that, or if so, where he spent his childhood in London. But what we know of Anthony Powell is he did see the Albert Memorial as a child. And so when he's there as a young adult trying to get a girlfriend, he's also returning to that primordial layer of childhood, to his boyhood. And that's very interesting topographically. Next slide, Paul. You see that childhood has a geography. And this is obviously in Proust, very obvious. Powell does not echo Proust. It's one of the ways in which he does not try to imitate Proust, because Proust obviously goes so much into Marcel's feeling as a child and Jenkins does not. Dance conversely starts with Jenkins as an adolescent, as a very young man, but he is somebody, when we meet him in Question of Upbringing, he is essentially an adult. He's ready to learn about women. He's very interested. Templar had a woman in London, or at least says he had a woman in London. He's learning about friendship. He's learning about manners. He's learning about society from the Fairbrother stripling incident, and less successfully the French language. And it's very amusing, of course, that the young Nicholas Jenkins goes to France with the Leroy to stay with the Leroy family in Touraine to learn French. And 7 books later, we see he does not have adequate command of the French language to be a liaison at the battalion level, or to harangue troops loyal to Vichy in Lebanon over to the Free French. And it's interesting, in the tale of the education of Nicholas Jenkins, the French language, of course, the language of Proust, is something that he never masters. By the time we do get Jenkins as a child in the 6th book, in The Kindly Ones, it is a flashback. It is something that the Robert Selig mentions this word in his book. It is an analepsis, to use the very fancy Latin word there. It's a going back. And we are well into understanding Jenkins as an adult. We've just seen Jenkins in Casanova's Chinese restaurant entering his 30s. And the Stonehurst eclogue is a replenishing, embracing prehistory, but we already know Jenkins as an adult. The sequence would be very different if we started out in June 1914 with that exact first 70 or 80 pages of The Kindly Ones, but that was the beginning of the entire novel. It would emphasize childhood much more to do that. AP does not like to start with childhood. He likes to flash back. Even in the memoirs, the American edition, which I have, the Holt, Reinhardt, and Winston edition, and it's always bracing to remember that his original publishers for Dance, Little Brown, did not want to publish the memoirs, and the lesser firm of Holt, Reinhardt, and Winston had to do so. All these firms are as gone as Cyrus the Great at this point in the contemporary publishing environment, but they existed in the late 1970s. In the American edition of the memoirs, the genealogical chapters, which in the English edition began Infants of the Spring, they are put at the back. So for the Americans, he started with his childhood. The American love of linearity and perhaps distrust of the past prevailed. But in the book as he intended it, as published in England, he actually begins with the extensive account of his genealogy going back to 10th century Wales, and does not begin in his childhood. He seems to want to avoid the forward trajectory model of starting the story from childhood. The novel of growing up or it's sometimes called the Bildungsroman. I always tell my students who tend to use those terms interchangeably, those terms are slightly different because the novel of growing up is mainly about up to 18. There's the Bildungsroman, which is about growing up in a culture. The German original has that implication, goes into the hero's 20s. And in a book like Gottfried Keller's Green Henry, the Grüne Heinrich, the character of that, the narrator of that, the protagonist of that book, Ulrich Drensdorf, spends a lot of time in his 20s. And therefore, I would not equate those terms, although they are often equated. But both of them have the assumption that the self is something which starts from childhood and grows up and expands. I think AP is pretty skeptical of that. And he's probably skeptical of the 19th century liberal assumptions of such a narrative. He does not necessarily agree with William Wordsworth that the child is father of the man. He does not subscribe to that 19th century optimistic sense of the self, that the self is ever growing, and that the self in a way traces a society that is only getting better. He is a 20th century man. He is writing after the upheaval and trauma of World War I, and he has a different sense of things. Next slide, please, Paul. Yet, and I would really, this is where I part company from a lot of people who write on Paul, particularly his detractors. He does not reject linearity or development. And the greatest mistake critics make about Anthony Paul is they accuse him of being a snob. He is not a snob. But the second greatest mistake is to see him as anti-temporal. And they see him as somebody like Percy Wyndham Lewis or T.E. Hume, the influential early 20th century critic, who famously spoke of the time disease, the vorticist movement, which emphasized projective space and didn't want that narrative of development, that sense of going forward. I think, although it is always said, oh, AP is more like Wyndham Lewis than he's like Joyce or Woolf or whoever, I adamantly reject that. He read Wyndham Lewis. He was interested in Wyndham Lewis. He did not share Wyndham Lewis's ultra-right politics. He was a moderate conservative. That is very different from what Wyndham Lewis was politically. And he does not have Wyndham Lewis seldom got away from satire. Because if you don't believe in development and if you don't believe in the depths of human character, you can't really do anything but mock the apes of God from the outside. But AP, following Proust, who is incredibly Wordsworthian and incredibly introspective, and as evident in the title of the sequence itself, we know, of course, it's from the Poussin painting, but just as a title, A Dance to the Music of Time, he sees time as a crucial variable in life. It is not always linear. It's not always 1 to 100. It's not, I think more precisely, the way we interact with it isn't always linear. And as Jenkins ages, he goes back to the past, he ruminates, he remembers, one incident calls up another, and there is nostalgia, there is reflection, there is that spiral that we saw in the Boyhood of Liverpool passage. It's not always linear, but he does not dismiss ideas of life accumulating meaning, development, and growth. And for him, as for Proust, it all starts in childhood, even if, unlike Proust, he does not start out the sequence with an extended memory of himself as a child and what it is like to be a child. he starts out the sequence with himself on the verge of adulthood, at school at 15. He still has the sense of reflecting on the meaning of what it is to be alive, of that starting in childhood. Next slide, please, Paul. As Hilary Sperling said on The Kindly Ones, that I really think I couldn't have done this paper before Sperling wrote her biography. And as much as people know, I think the Michael Barber biography is a good book. I value Michael's work, but he didn't have access to the archive that Hilary Sperling did. And she got a real sense of what AP's childhood is. And I think the work she did, the research she did in the biography enriches our sense to see childhood as consequential to Powell's work. And this informs what she says in the biography about the Kindly Ones and its perspective on the First World War. Impending catastrophe is presented in double focus, viewed in hindsight by the middle-aged narrator and seen simultaneously with a child-piercing clarity by his younger self. Jenkins' childhood is touched by the specific times in which it unfolds. And the first section of The Kindly Ones is not a story of an 8-year-old boy whose father is a military officer. It is a story about a child who, in a way, his childhood comes to an end at 8 because of Sarajevo, because of the event that Uncle Giles announced. Because after that, even though his father survives the war, his father goes to war, and the parents of so many of his classmates, the fathers of so many of his classmates, die in the war. And so it's very different from a generic childhood. And I had a student about 10 years ago who was 8 when 9/11 happened, and whose father escaped the towers, survived, but had to run for his life. And she said much the same thing, that at that point, her childhood ended. So the childhood in The Kindly Ones is a very lyrical evocation of a childhood as a prequel, as a flashback, but it is also a sense of the declarative ending of a childhood. And of course, it's so funny, the Bilson incident and the arrival of Uncle Giles and Trelawney and General Conyers, it's such a hilarious section. We actually tend not to see it from what the child might have felt, what the child felt when Uncle Giles gave the news from Bosnia, but we know. And we know in a way that that child informs the introspective and somewhat standoffish young adult we see in Question of Upbringing. Next slide, please, Paul. Jenkins does have a childhood, and he refers to it frequently in the books. As a child, you are in some ways more acutely aware of what people feel about one another than you are when childhood has come to an end. Childhood is the source of your sense of other people's feelings. And when the adult Jenkins writes about various types of people, from Watkin to Kedward to Trapnell to Pamela Flitton to Delavacquery, his sense of what it might be to feel like them comes from the empathy and curiosity he had as a child when experience was so new and the colors, as it were, of other people shone so brightly. Next slide, please, Paul. So does Pamela. And it's interesting what other characters in Dance have a childhood. We already talked about Winberpool. And even though Winberpool's childhood is not given a full up close and personal treatment like in the Olympic coverage. We do have a sense of what it must have been like. His father died early. His mother was very ambitious for him. He knew aristocrats, but was not himself. He knew at least landed gentry, but doesn't know, the drawings were titled. He knew aristocrats, but he is not one of them. And he gets into the school that we all know is Eden, but is markedly inferior there and is mocked and is bullied there. And we have the sense of where he came from. Pamela, we see long before she becomes the femme fatale of the 9th, 10th, and 11th books, we see her in the second book. And Byers Market is the bedrock of Dance to the Music of Time. It's where so much comes from. As late as Glober, he comes from that world of the Byers Market. And we first see Pamela, who is only a little child of Stringham's wedding, the daughter of Flavia Weisbeit, who is remarried after divorcing Cosmo Flitton. And she's there when Stringham marries Lady Peggy Stepney. Little Pamela Flitton, who was holding the bride's train, felt sick at the same moment and rejoined her nurse at the back of the church. And in the light of what we know about Pamela and how Pamela dies and how Pamela lives, it's very ominous. And of course, the initial reader of the Byers Market barely notices Pamela Flitton. Who's that? We're already meeting the slew of debutantes and bohemians and men in suits and so on, and we barely notice. We're just interested, well, who's Jenkins going to marry? Stringham's marrying Lady Peggy. Is Jenkins going to marry Barbara or Gypsy or one of these women? We don't notice. At least I didn't when I first, I had no idea Pamela Flitton was going to come back. But Powell gives her that childhood, and giving her that childhood underscores her, I think, as one of the major characters in the sequence. Paul, please turn to the next slide. So does Moreland. This is one of my favorite quotes in Dance. I love this quote. It's a great quote about friendship. That two friends who meet as adults, they find that even though they never knew each other as children, they had the same childhood. I love this quote. What Moreland and I possessed unexpectedly in common, however, was on the whole more remarkable than these obvious contrasts. Jenkins is a man of words and Moreland is a man of music, and might have had some acute comments on Frederick the Great's ability to compose a flute concerto. With only a month or two between our ages, some accumulation of shared experience was natural enough. The dog following Edward VII's coffin, the Earl's Court exhibition, tents in Hyde Park for George V's coronation, these all found a place. There were, however, in addition to these public spectacles, certain unaccountable products of the zeitgeist belonging to both childhoods, contributing some particle to each personal myth, so abundant in their way that Moreland and I sometimes seem to have known each other long before meeting for the first time one evening in the saloon bar of the Mortimer. That's beautiful. And part of his friendship for Moreland is he looks at him and says, I didn't know him as a child, but I did know him as a child on a deeper level. And in a sense, I knew him as a child better than the boys I actually went to school with, because we had the same feelings, much as it is said of Septimus Smith and Mrs. Dalloway in Virginia Woolf's novel, Mrs. Dalloway, that even though they never met each other, they were connected because they felt the same feelings. Here, we have people who felt the same feelings as children, and then as adults, they do meet each other. It's a beautiful quote, and it again explains why Moreland is his most important friend, because he has a childhood. Paul, please show the next slide. And I want to point out something I think was a false start in AP's planning of dance. We know from the January 1989 entry in the journals, when AP rereads the entire sequence, and he does so with the absolute distance that he will read a Dickens novel or a Conrad novel in the journals, but he knows what he was doing when he was writing it. And he says that he had several false starts. And he mentions one of them with Monsieur Dubuisson, that Monsieur Dubuisson was originally intended to come back with the Free French in the, who of course is in the first book in the La Grenadière section, was intended to come back as a Free French liaison officer in the Military Philosophers, but AP rejected that as too neat. And I think this is another instance where in the final trilogy, the last 3 books, AP is thinking of introducing another childhood and introducing a childhood of the generation of his children. And Jenkins is at school to make arrangements for a son's education. We assume paralleling AP going there vis-a-vis Tristram. And he meets Labat. This is at the end of Books to Furniture Room, the beginning of which he had met Sillery in researching his Robert Burton book, Borage and Hellbore. At the end, he meets Labat. And Labat is being hectored by a boy. This assurance that his own hopes were wholly unimportant, that youth was prepared to waste valuable time indefinitely while age span out his senile conference, did not in the least impress Labat, too conversant with the ways of boys not to be forever on his guard. And of course, Jenkins's teacher, for lack of a better word, I know that doesn't exactly describe what Labat is in Etonian terms. Jenkins's teacher is still alive. And of course, when you talk to your teacher, no matter if you're 52, you still feel like you're 8. And Jenkins is feeling like he's 15 again. And this boy is heckling the now much older Labat. Sir, the Dictionary of Phrase and Fable, Brewers? I think so, sir. You've looked in the proper shelf? Of course, sir. What's your name? Ackworth, sir. Labat rose. And we remember the name Ackworth. Ackworth was the boy who sent a note to Peter Templar and on the connivance of Liverpool was expelled. And we might guess accurately that AP is setting up by seeding this in the 12th book. He's setting up something climactic in the 12th book involving a final reckoning between Ackworth and Winterpool, and that in fact occurs. But you notice, it is not a male Ackworth, it is Claire Ackworth and Sebastian Cutts. It is their wedding. There is no male Ackworth of a younger generation. And he decided not to use this character. And this character was a false start for him and is evidence of a possible plan for setting up the denouement of the sequence that he did not follow through on. And maybe with that Ackworth, we would have seen him growing up a bit. We would have seen from this glimpse of him when young. And if he had married Selina Cutts at the end, there would be a tacit retracing of a second generation of children in the latter part of the sequence. And it's interesting both that this was present and that AP decided not to take this up. And I think it mirrors the way childhood is tacit in dance, but not explicit. Paul, could you please show the next slide? This is more from Sperling and from AP himself. Sperling says, Paul needed an energetic imagination to populate, as an only child, a sadly underpopulated world. And Paul himself always used the term creative fantasy, that writing is hard work, writing was something material, writing was something that was nuts and bolts, but you had to have creative fantasy. And somebody like the writer Malcolm Crowding, whose account of the debacle of Extrapnel in The Hero of Acre can be completely trusted, because Malcolm Crowding was a writer of little or no imagination, lacked that creative fantasy. Where does that creative fantasy come from? Childhood. Of course it comes from childhood. Childhood is the source. I couldn't find this quote, but I think it's somewhere in the collected criticism where he says, when he's writing about some other writer, childhood with its terrors and mysteries is the source of imaginative experience. And even though Poe was in many ways a realist writer who wrote about society, there was creative fantasy in his approach to the world, just as there is in Jane Austen or Trollope or other people who are realists, but also have their own world. Next slide, please. Childhood correlates with an interest in other people. John Aubrey's lonely childhood prompted him to show an intense interest in the past. You might say that Aubrey's childhood made him a gossip, precisely because he was making up for that loneliness. And you could see some of Jenkins as a narrator, his gossipiness, and his fascination with other people, their splendors and miseries, their high points and low points, as making up for that loneliness that is never detailed, but is felt as a child. And I think you do feel in The Kindly Ones that young child, even though he's surrounded by his parents and he has Albert and Bracy and he has his schoolmates, there is a loneliness there which makes him self-reliant and autonomous and severe and not self-pitying, and gives him all sorts of strengths of character, but also makes him feel he needs to populate a world, which he does through people who are real. They're not imaginary friends, but they're people in a way who he speculates about so vividly that they rise to the level of imaginary characters. And that's why we, as readers, relate to them so much as imaginary characters. Next slide, please. Childhood never ends. Jenkins is always younger than other people. Even in Hearing Secret Harmonies, Mr. Gauntlet must be 10 years older. Umfreville is older than him. There are always people who are older, and Jenkins feels young. Even in the journals, it is not until the third volume of the journals that AP is no longer meeting people older than him. Even in the second volume, he is meeting people who are a few years older than him. When Adrian Daintree dies, for instance, when he dies in the Charter House, that relationship is always, Adrian Daintree is just a few years older. And that's always a precondition of their friendship. In 1990, it's a hot summer, slightly cooler, heat having reached a peak on Friday, which equaled the heat of August 1911. He's remembering weather from 79 years before, out of the distant past. But that is still vivid for him. There must have been hot heat waves, even in England after August 1911, but it's the one in August 1911, when he was 5 years old, that he remembers. Next slide, please. Oops. Okay, no, one more. No, there's one more. Our friend, the illustrious emperor of the late 2nd, early 3rd century. Can we put him up? The Emperor Septimius Severus. This is an illustration from the journals from the 3rd volume. I could, let me get it on here in case I need to. Good Emperor. Do you have it? Okay, just give it another minute and then I'll just talk it through, because this is an illustration in the 3rd volume of the journals.
Sorry, Nick.
And-
Sorry, Nick, you better do it. I've got it, but I can't get it up.
Okay. This is, let me get it up. It's an illustration in the 3rd volume of the journals, and it is from it's a drawing by AP himself, and it's of the Emperor Septimius Severus, the Emperor of Rome from 197 to 211 AD. And of course, Septimius Severus is important in a couple of ways, that he died in York. He died in the city of Aboricum, which is later called York. And that is what the city I am in now, New York, is named after. And he, of course, was also the first African emperor and the first emperor of African descent to rule the Roman Empire. I will share my screen now. Share screen. And yes, desktop 1 and share. And then I'm going to do that and move out that and close this and close that and close that. My apologies. And close that too. And then you should have, let's pull this up right here, and sorry, no, that's not what I want. Here we go. Here it is. Okay. And here is the illustration. And this is AP. Septimius Severus has a boy flogged for reminding him he was at school together. Now, I do not know. I should ask John Powell this. I'm sure he would know. I have no idea what age Anthony Powell was when he drew this. Having no idea at all, whether he drew it as a child, whether he drew it when he was older, but it is such a childlike sketch. And it's about the successful adult man being revisited by his childhood and not wanting to remember it. But of course, that not wanting, that the emperor would have the man flogged for remembering his childhood means that his childhood still matters to him, only even that he's emperor. Even though he's emperor, the childhood still matters. And that is a great testimony to the power of childhood. Even if when a senior man of letters, the perpetual edges of childhood, its delight in humor and incongruity always remain in Anthony Powell. And he was somebody, obviously, Anthony Powell was a very mature man. He was a very wise man. He was somebody who was measured. He had a good temperament, and this is things that we value. And often when we say a writer is childlike, we talk about people like Edgar Allan Poe, who really couldn't keep themselves straight and didn't survive until 94. And none of that is true of Poe, but he had that childlike delight in imagination and incongruity. And that remained with him to the end. And I think realizing that gives us an appreciation of why he is a truly great novelist who can encompass the whole realm of human experience. Thank you very much. And I think sorry for the technical snafus, and we should have some time for questions.
Thank you, Nick. Just a reminder that please can you raise your hand to if you want to ask a question. That should put you, I'm not quite sure what my screen's doing at the moment either, but that should put you in an orderly queue on my screen. I think everybody is probably on mute, so you will need to either Alt-A or hold your space bar to unmute when you want to speak. Anybody want to start us off? Paul, you're on.
Yeah, Nick, I remember AP saying, I think it was to Malcolm Muggeridge, when Muggeridge asked him about his time at Eton, AP said the most important thing was that I had a room to myself.
Yeah. And I think he really valued that. And I think at Eton, his creativity came out and he got away from his parents. And of course, he began his interest in art in Eton. And of course, he hated his prep school. And he could have written about the New Beacon, the kind of thing that George Orwell wrote about St. Cyprian's Eastbourne and such were the joys. He didn't, except reporting that he and Henry York, his classmate, hated his prep school because he found it very regimented and preposterous. But actually at Eton, he did find freedom. And those are two words which are not often associated, but he did find it there. That's very true. And that meant a room of one's own.
The other interesting thing there is that AP himself said that, and Lady Violet echoed this to me, found Eton a stabilizing influence and very much felt that it was home almost, because his father was in the army, so his childhood was very itinerant.
Mm-hmm.
And he actually flourished at Eton because of that.
Yeah. He had no childhood home to go back to. And of course, he is somebody for whom, unlike Evelyn Waugh, for whom Oxford was the great experience, for him, high school, secondary school was the great experience, the school closer to childhood. And Oxford for AP was anticlimactic. He valued the learning he got there, he valued the friends and the social networks and so on, but it is Eton which became part of the personal myth.
It's interesting too that his peripatetic childhood, he actually talks about, I think in the memoirs, talking about during the First War, that he and his mother in London, stayed in odd boarding houses, odd hotels, with friends, whatever, and he mentions a couple, but Lady Violet actually said to me, he probably, this was after his death, he probably wouldn't actually have remembered all of them.
Mm-hmm.
I was trying to actually sort of trace out, where he'd lived, and she said, don't know. He probably didn't know, probably didn't remember. So, that's how disruptive it was. Elizabeth has got her hand up.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, good. Hi, Nick. I want to talk to you more about this later, but I'm working on Goethe's autobiography, The Poetry and Truth. I wonder, first of all, one thing really interests me is that Goethe does not talk about childhood friends at all in the early chapters. They're just not there. And his first friendships are really when he's, in his early 20s. Do you know if Powell knew Goethe's autobiography? I'm very interested because a lot of the scholars on the subject of Poetry and Truth call it a fictionalized, work. And,
Dichtung in Unwahrheit. I do not know. I do not know whether AP knew that work. I'm sure he read Goethe. I don't recall any references. I think Pohl read a lot in. I don't think he could read. I don't think he could read German really well enough to read things in the original. But he read a lot of German in translation. I just don't know whether he read that. But I will try to investigate. My sense is, as much as he talks about his reading, and as in the journals and the memoirs and in Illusions and Dance, and as wide a range of the books are reviewed by him, I think there are things he read that we don't know that he read. And I think that could be one of them. He was such an omnivorous reader. I would always suspect he had read something if it was available to him in English or French, even if he doesn't mention it. But I will try to look into it.
That's good.
Thank you. Joanna?
John Trotter.
John, sorry.
John. He's gone to sleep.
Can I see a hand? Okay. No,
okay.
I think he's moved now.
Okay.
No, John?
We'll move on. Noreen.
Noreen.
Need to unmute myself. I would say from the years I worked at the V&A Museum of Childhood, most people have little or no recollection of much detail of their childhood.
Mm.
And that's from quite an early age. I've talked to many, many people about their childhood, and so many of them have said, even people in their 20s, do you know, I really can't remember anything about my childhood much. So I think we do have to bear that in mind.
Yeah, we don't start forming proper memories and remembering things, and this is scientifically established, most of us, until we're sort of somewhere in the region of 3. So, and some of my early memories I know are from when I would have been sort of 4, something like that. I've got the odd little glimpse before that, but that's all. Yeah. And I think that's, as Noreen says, I think that's very common.
Yeah.
Well, it's not so much purely that people don't remember until they're after 3. A lot of people cannot tell you anything about what happened before they were 12.
Yeah. And I had with my grandparents, it was very interesting in my grandparents. Some of them had very detailed recollection of their childhood. Some of them couldn't really remember the first thing about it. And exactly. I noticed that with them. I myself, I was born in 1965. I have one memory of the 1960s, which is the moon landing, which is probably the most important event in history. And that was so important, it got into my head. But I have no other memories of the 1960s. And it really, again, the moment, I think that first passage I read, when AP's 5.5, and he realizes he's himself, that's, I think, the moment for most people, and I'm not a developmental psychologist and so on, but that's the moment. I do think you could put this another way. I said childhood is the source of all imagination. Maybe, in light of Noreen's comment, maybe the imaginative writer is the person who remembers their childhood. Maybe that's a necessity to be a writer, is to have that, and maybe that willingness to reinvestigate your childhood and to go over some painful moments, because everybody has sufferings in their childhood. Childhood is not all idyllic. Childhood has a lot of loss and trauma in it. In AP's case, as Keith mentioned, the dislocation of being in places so provisional that he didn't even remember where he was. And I do think he has such a good awareness of London. I think that early moving around London, probably he childhood and that topographical assurance of Anthony Powell are so interconnected. But yeah, that he couldn't even remember it. And maybe it takes a certain kind of courage and or imagination to come to grips with that. And that's a good point, Noreen. Not everybody does that. Not everybody has the Proustian, introspective scrutinizing of their childhood that certain writers do and certain readers do.
I think sometimes perhaps it's a thing, it's not all only children, but maybe it's a tendency. I mean, Keith always says he doesn't remember that much of his early childhood. I've just about brought the whole lot out up there in my head. Noel Streatfeild, the writer yes. mainly of children's and adult books. I think
the ballet book. Didn't he do the ballet book? Yes.
Yes, yeah. Ballet shoes. But she's another person who I think brought everything out of childhood with her. Mm-hmm. It's not everything, but it's far more than most people are comfortable with.
Yeah. And the other thing is you notice that children's writers like to write series or sequences. And there's so many of the great children's books are sequences, or like the Alice book, there's a sequel, and the sequentiality of dance. There's a children's book aspect to it, even though the books are very much adult. Yeah. And again, I read the books at 14, as I talk about a lot, and I was an adult in some ways, but I was still a child in some ways. And I remember reading The End of the Acceptance World. And part of me was Nick Jenkins kind of discovering his adult sexuality with Jean Templar. But part of me was wondering, what about Polly? What does little Polly Duport? I mean, I was a child of divorce. What does little Polly Duport feel about her mother taking up with other men? And I had that sense of being partly a child and partly an adult. And I think a lot of people do start reading Powell as teenagers, even though most of his material is about adults in love, at work, at war.
John, you've had your hand up for a long time. You're still on mute. That's better.
Oh, he's doing it. He's doing it. Yeah. Okay, John?
Yes, is this John you want, is it?
Yes, it's this John.
Yes, Nick, it was a really interesting talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Just a comment and then a question. I've just reread Books Do Furnish a Room, and I hadn't picked up the Ackworth reference that the name comes up again in the last volume, but the sentence after the passage you quote in the library is a lovely one, where Jenkins says, "It was clear as he went away that some elaborate form of ragging was being prepared for Labat in the library," which was rather nice. So his fears of and suspicion about young boys were entirely justified. So Ackworth would have been a bit of a character, I think, if he'd been developed more.
And AP likes that. AP likes that kind of a playfulness and the pulling a prank that the child has. He likes the sense of Ackworth maybe being a bit of a scamp. He empathizes with that rather than Labat there. Yes, please, John.
Yeah, and then the question really is, I don't know whether AP said anything about that, but it seems to me that if you're an only child, not only do your powers of imagination get developed, but your powers of observation have a chance to develop enormously, because you're often sitting there in a room with adults watching what's going on. And that's very clear in, for example, those favorite passages from the kindly ones that you just quoted for us. Do you agree with that?
Yes, and you're not put at the children's table when if you're one of 6 like Lady Violet. There's a children's table and you're put at, and you don't interact with the adults. But yes, if you're an only child, you get to hear Conyers and Trelawney and Uncle Giles, and get to hear Uncle Giles's opinions and hear that kind of adult discourse, and maybe get socialized a bit early, even as and I was an only child myself, in the sense that I have half siblings, but they're much younger from my father's subsequent marriage. And I grew up as an only child. And I in a way knew how to get along with adults much more than I did with people my age because of that. So I understand that, how that might be. But I think it did give him some advantages as a perceiver, as that kind of perceiving self, which is an observant self, but also a mischievous self, a playful self. Yeah.
Thank you.
Colin's got his hand up.
Yeah. Hi, Nick. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. Plenty of insight into the novel. I'm particularly struck by the slide you put up there around Moreland and Nick Jenkins' friendship. That notion of a deep heterosexual friendship, a deep friendship that is not homosexual, if you like, a meeting of spirits.
That's right.
What it brought to mind was that that similar friendship between Montaigne and Etienne de la Boétie, who equally died young. La Boétie, I think, died in his 20s, and Moreland, of course, was someone older than that. But that notion, when Montaigne said, when he was asked to explain it, he said, "I cannot explain it, but it was because the friendship was because he was he and I was I."
That's right.
It seemed to me that this was the same point, I suppose, you were making there with regard to Moreland and Nick Jenkins. I don't know if you'd like to comment.
Oh, that's a beautiful comment. And I think I've been thinking about Montaigne a lot. I mentioned him earlier. I was wondering whether A.P. Moore read Montaigne, or did he sense Montaigne through Montaigne's influence on Hamlet, which scholars talk about so much, since obviously Hamlet was so important to A.P. But I think that's there. And yes, it's not there it is not a there is not a homoerotic affect in his relationship with Moreland. It's a sense of affinity, of having noticed the same things, and they could turn to each other and say, "Hey, do you remember this?" And it's something that was in 1911 that neither of they didn't meet till 1929, but they could relate 1911 together. And it's something they noticed. And of course, Dr. Trelawney, I mean, that is a entree to Dr. Trelawney also being in Moreland's life. And the coincidence that Dr. Trelawney and his, essence of the all was the Godhead of the true, etc., his cult makes this impact on these young boys from very different backgrounds and very different locations, but they have that in common. It's a very strong moment. I don't think the criticism has talked about it much. It is something I noticed only reading it as an adult, and by the time I had more friendships and that kind of mattered to me more. It's a very strong quote. It's one of the great moments, and it really is why that friendship with Moreland. Even though he meets Stringham earlier, Moreland is his soulmate among his male friends.
Yeah, and I mean, I knew it, but I didn't know it until I'd seen that slide. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. Wesley has got his hand up. John and Colin, can you put your hands down, please? Oh, yeah. Wesley.
Oh, thank you so much for the talk. Very enjoyable. I've been teaching Dance the Music of Time for 12 months, a book a month.
Wow.
In the seasons that they're meant to be in at the Rosenbach Museum in Philadelphia, virtually. And we've done it for the whole year of lockdown. And we had our last class last Tuesday. And I'm not ashamed to say I've lent heavily on your brilliant work and the book. So thank you very much for that. What I wanted to say in regard to what Colin was just saying, it's interesting how that makes you reflect on the friendship with Gibson de la Vacquerie in the last volume, because, he speaks explicitly about the difficulties of old age male friendship, and Colin's remarks made me think of that. But what I just want to say about the childhood thing is, it's not really a question, and it's not a very well thought out thought, but the sequence, you said you started reading it when you were
14.
Teenage?
Yeah.
The sequence starts with a coming of age novel. It's very Catcher in the Rye, the first one, with its cynicism at cynicism about school and the rituals and how the schoolmaster is fake and how they're all just playing along in a game. So it's not surprising that since it starts with the coming of age bit with the upbringing, that you can only ever flash back to childhood. So it's a funny criticism to say he doesn't talk about childhood when the very theme of the book is childhood to begin with.
Yeah. And I taught Catcher in the Rye a couple of years ago. And it's so interesting because it comes out the same year as Question of Upbringing. And Holden starts out with these two friends, Ackley and Stradlater, at his school. And Jenkins, of course, has Stringham and Templar. And I mean, they're very different schools, but it's that same feeling. And yes, I probably read Catcher in the Rye originally a year before I read Dance. And everybody was reading Catcher in the Rye. And nobody in New York, at least, was reading Question of Upbringing. But I do think there's a similarity. And I think it actually helps elucidating the achievement of both those books by juxtaposing them. So I totally agree. That's really great about the Rosenbach Library. It's a wonderful institution. I've only visited it twice, but I've cherished my visits to it. It's a great institution in Philadelphia. And those of you in the US or whoever come here should visit it. And I'm glad you've been doing it during the pandemic. And thank you for using my book.
Oh, it was great. And a couple of my students are right here. I've lost them right now, but there they are.
Okay.
Anyway, thank you.
Hello.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Thank you, Wesley. Chris has got his hand up. You're on mute.
Okay. Okay. I am one of Wesley Stace's students.
Excellent.
At the Rosenbach, and my introduction to Anthony Powell is through Wesley Stace and the class. And over the past 12 months, we have had a great time going through each one of the books, which has led me further into Anthony Powell, joining the society, reading some of his other novels. And Hilary Sperling's biography, and I have, Nick, I have your Understanding Anthony Powell on my book list next.
Thank you.
So I just want to say it's been a wonderful experience, and I have to thank Wesley. And it's just eye-opening for me as someone who really was not familiar with Powell before.
Yeah. And thank you very much. And again, kudos to Wesley for all the good work that he's doing. I think we have Michael Henley on this call as well, who teaches dance a lot. And I've taught dance at NYU and at the Society Library. And I know John Gould has done it at the Phillips Andover and at the Athenaeum in Boston. And every person you teach dance to, that opens up a world to them, and they have that world forever. So it's wonderful that you have that. And it's especially in the US, AP is still too little known. I think the Sperling biography and the reviews it received has helped. I think some people are turning to it during the pandemic because people have time to read longer books. I think longer books are in general becoming more popular, but any bit of proselytizing you could do is welcome. And it's great that you joined the society, and hopefully you could come to our next meeting at the Grolier Club, our birthday luncheon at the Grolier Club in New York in December 2022. And hopefully we'll have some more events, as people start meeting again, we'll have some more events here that you could get involved with. And hopefully there'll be another a real life conference in England eventually that we could all go to. So I delight in new readers of AP.
I'll second your comments, Nick, about people reading dance and Wesley's work. Wesley and the pandemic, and I'm not suggesting they're linked, of course, between them have sort of generated a trickle of new members for the society. I won't say it's been a flood, but we have gained a few members over the last couple of years, and slightly more than I would have expected. So that's good. So thank you all for that. One comment I will make is that the penguin of the memoirs, you talked, Nick, about the genealogical chapters at the beginning of infants being relegated to the back in the US members. In the Penguin sort of omnibus edition, they're pretty much excised altogether. Which is a great shame, but it is abridged, and that's one of the fairly heavy abridgments that they did.
Well, I think didn't Powell himself make the abridgments?
I don't know.
My impression is that he himself made the
He may well have done.
Yeah.
He may well have done. I'll, at risk of taking you off in a slightly different direction, your comments about the linearity of time brought back to my mind John Gould's talk at our very first conference in 2001 at Eton, where he talks about basically dance is effectively AP painting a mural, and as he finishes one panel, some guy comes along and gives him another panel to paint, and then another panel to paint, and the whole thing moves along, and it is sort of very much like a mural. And that paper is in the original proceedings of the
and I highly recommend that paper. It's in the first volume that the Society published, and that paper was in my head as well. That says AP in the Future. It's called Anthony Powell and the Future, and it's talking about how the time of the books and the time of the composition are in a kind of dynamic relationship. And that was in my head when I wrote this as well. I didn't actually go back to it and reread it, but my memory of it was there. And I think that John very skillfully talks about how the work is at once linear, but also in another way doubles back on itself. And that Sperling quote about the kindly ones also emphasizes that. Critics often get so taken up with the recursiveness, and this also comes up with Proust criticism, that they neglect the linear, that there is development. I talked about this in my talk at the York conference in 2016. There is a purpose to the life of Nicholas Jenkins. It moves forward, he learns, he accumulates, and for there to be a purpose, life has to be a journey that begins in childhood and that values and reflects upon childhood. Those are all bound up together.
Yeah, and I agree. Dance is very linear.
Yeah.
I guess I'm one of the people who maybe has a slight, well, not a particularly big problem with that, in that when I first read it, I found A Question of Upbringing very slow, and almost didn't carry on. And I'm one of the people who finds Hearing Secret Harmonies, you know, one of the weakest books of the series. Again, you know, AP's trying to tie up the threads. But you know, I mean, and this is a point I've made before, and I remember I've had this discussion in public with Gray Gowrie. For me, Hearing Secret Harmonies is weak, because Powell doesn't get the 60s, early 70s, you know. It's not my late 60s, early 70s. But then, as Gray pointed out, Powell was looking at it as a, what was he, 65 when he was writing that book?
Yeah.
You know, he's a little bit younger than I am now, you know, and it's like asking me now to write something about the current culture of the current student population. I wouldn't have a clue.
Yep. No, nor would I. Nor would I. I'm younger than you, nor would I. Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, you and I have had this discussion for many years. I wasn't old enough, as I just said, to go through the 60s, and so I didn't particularly mind that. I like Hearing Secret Harmonies. I would say, to I think Wesley's comment, and I did argue this in my talk at the Wallace Collection in 2005, Hearing Secret Harmonies for me depends on the Delavacqueri is a very key character. And there's a sense where Delavacqueri, it's almost too late for them to be friends, and it's almost too late for a new character to come up in the book and mean anything.
Yes.
And I think Powell was aware that he was very much on the precipice with Delavacqueri, but Murtlock, as mesmerizing as Murtlock is, and as much of a role he plays with the denouement of Liverpool, there's also the whole Delavacqueri, Fiona, Gwyneth triangle, which is another part of the 60s and another part of people younger than him. I would also point to Powell's friendship with McLaren Ross, aka Jenkins' relationship with Trapnell. That was a writer almost young enough to be his son, who in both cases, the elder writer kind of takes under their wing and fosters. I agree with you about Question of Upbringing. I always tell people, persist till buyer's market. Buyer's market is where it all begins. And I'm not saying I don't like Question of Upbringing because I love it, but to understand the sequence, the absolute bedrock of it is a buyer's market.
Yeah, by the time I'd finished a buyer's market, I was hooked.
Oh yeah.
Absolutely hooked.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I always say to people that, you know, and they say, where do I start with dance? What, you know, well, it depends what sort of personality you are. If you're somebody who has to do things in sequence, then you have to start with the Question of Upbringing, but do be warned that you might find it slow. If you need to be captivated by a work, start with something in the middle, like Lady Molly's or Casanova's or The Kindly One, or one of the military trilogy, if that's what turns you on. You know, start in the middle, because you will then get much more something that'll capture you.
And we have to remember, both you and I, Keith, discovered the sequence after it was complete. But for people reading it in the middle, they often discovered it through the book that was being reviewed at the time. And that's how Congressman John Monaghan and Jonathan Cooperstein and my mother, they all discovered it through the 7th, 8th, 9th volumes being reviewed in the American papers and reading that book and then going back.
Yeah. Michael Henley has got his hand up. Hello, Michael.
Hello, Michael.
Thank you.
You're on mute again, Michael.
You just slipped back. There you go. Perfect.
As a former or mathematician, I want to comment on the linearity of time in dance. It's not truly linear in the sense of a straight line. It's quite different from that. It's linear in a way through the 20s and 30s, but then it speeds up. And of course, the last volume, which we've been talking about, zips through a vast span of time. So I just want to point this out. I'm sure that this is in most people's minds when they think about dance, how time is really a little bit more flexible than the word linear implies. That's all.
No,
Time is not
you're right.
Time is not linear. We know time is not linear. You know, I mean, we experience time as not being consistently linear.
And that's the whole point.
How many times can you get up in the morning and shower and shave or whatever and be ready to go out to work and think, I mean, I'm a quarter of an hour early? And how many days do you then do exactly the same routine and, oh, I'm half an hour late? You know,
well, it's the
so
whole point
we know time isn't linear, and it is not linear across our lifetimes either.
And that's the whole point about childhood as well.
Yeah.
That how our memories are weighted towards that childhood.
Time, and again, the scientific research being done into this, time seems to pass faster to us as we age. Because when we're young, life is full of, interesting things that happen, whatever. They're new, so they stick, and you experience time as relatively so. As we get older, the new things are relatively few and far between, so we see time passing much faster.
Yeah.
So in that sense, it's not linear.
Yeah. And I agree with you, Michael, and the books do accelerate, and the acceleration in the last trilogy is in a way part of the aesthetic effect as the characters grow so much older so quickly, whereas between Acceptance World takes up almost immediately after Buyer's Market. Lady Molly's, there's a bit of a gap because the Great Depression has to happen, the slump has to happen, we have to get into the 30s, but generally they're linear. Then there's that gap between Books to Furniture Room and Temporary Kings of about 7 years, and then about 10 years between TK and HSH. I always think with series, the last volume is permitted to go really forward in time. If any of you have read the Elena Ferrante tetralogy, you notice her last book goes over 30 years. I often wonder with Temporary Kings whether that was set in the late 50s because life peerages were not introduced into the late 50s. And so much of that book hinges on Pamela being Lady Winterpool. And that might be one of the reasons he put that book in 1958. The other thing is, as AP, just rereading that entry in the journals from 1989, he was not always committed to it being 12 books. He thought it might be 9 or 10. He commits to 12 before the Kindly Ones. And we notice the way the Stonehurst prequel Analepsis is put in the Kindly Ones, that there are going to be 12 because that closes up the sextet. The Kindly Ones is such a capstone, and he almost commits to 12. And so he then almost tacitly commits to 12. He explicitly commits to 12 in his correspondence with Bernard Bergensie, I think the next year. So he has to get it all within 12, which means he has to flash forward. And I agree with you that I mean, yes, what 2011 matters less to me than 1977 does in my life. Absolutely. The distant past matters more. That's true with most people as they grow older. But I also think AP wanted to get the sequence done with and wanted to end it, and wanted to end it well, and wanted to end it before, in his mind, he got too old to finish it. And so he had to speed things up for that very material reason.
Another time shift is the war trilogy, in which time slows down because there is so much more incident.
Good point. And it's always bracing to remember the first 2 books of the war trilogy only go up to June 1941. And the US has not even entered the war for those first 2 books. And Soldier's Art, of course, ends on June 22nd, 1941, when the Germany invades the Soviet Union. And it's a book, a year a book. Valley of Bones is the Phony War and Dunkirk and so on. And then Soldier's Art is 1940-41. And that is something to remember there.
Paul has got his hand up.
So Keith, I'd like to sort of bring this to a close now. We've gone on sort of for an hour and a half and a bit more.
Oh, crumbs.
Can I just say it's been a privilege to listen to Nick. We've tried to replicate a physical conference in a virtual world, and other than the odd technical snafu, I think it's proving to be a great success and a great boon to the society. So can I just say to Nick, thank you so much for the presentation and for all your comments. I mean, your immersion in the world of Anthony Powell enriches all of us. So it's been a privilege to listen to you.
Yeah.
Just to say, we went over time today, and we went over time for the first one. So we are thinking of having some Zoom sessions outside these presentations, maybe linked to the newsletter publications, where members of the society can get together like this and have a chat and discuss various issues.
I have put dates in the upcoming newsletter, Paul, and I've staggered the times so that for some of them, those of you in the US, it will be a nice, convenient time, and for others, it will be a nice, convenient time for the Eastern Hemisphere. So to try and include everybody a bit more. Sorry, Paul.
Yeah, and just keep an eye on the website, because we're going to be announcing more lectures in our series. The next one, just as a reminder, will be Colin Donald on the 23rd of March, talking about AP and Dickens.
That should be exciting. I'm excited by that.
So we look forward to that.
Yeah.
My last thing to say is, I mean, the Morland quote, Nick, reminded me, I mean, AP was a solitary child, and solitary people really need to reach out and make connections. And they do that when they find people who feel the same way as they do, in the same way that Jenkins and Morland did. And it reminded me of the time when AP met George Orwell in the Cafe Royal, I think it was. And AP and Orwell were not necessarily natural bedfellows, but a small incident where AP asked Orwell about his military uniform and asked him if the trousers strapped underneath the foot. And Orwell said, yes, they do. And AP said, well, that's the most important thing, is it? And Orwell said, absolutely, to have the trousers strapped under the foot. Absolutely. And they made a connection between the two of them in the way, okay, this is somebody who feels exactly the same way as I do. And I think for a solitary child, that those sorts of incidents, and we see that in Dance Through Jenkins, were very important. So just to say thank you to Nick again. Thanks for everybody for joining us.
Thank you, Nick.
Look forward to our next session. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for everybody for coming. I look forward to seeing people in person at some point.
Okay,
Great.
everybody.
Thank you, Nick.
So
Thank you.
Cheers.
Okay. Bye.
Cheers.
Bye.